On May 20th, 1999, on the main street of Snowtown, Australia, a police car sat outside an abandoned state bank. Several hours later, the place would be full of police and reporters. But right then, only two officers standing at the door waiting for backup before entering the bank together. Their job was to find a woman who had not been seen for 6 months, 37-year-old Elizabeth Hayden. After months of investigation, the clues ultimately brought them to this abandoned bank. Not long after, the police went into the bank's vault. Upon entering, a strong, rotting smell hit them so hard that some of the officers threw up right there. Inside the vault were 6 black plastic barrels, each with a lid on top. The barrels contained acid and mummified human remains. Some were in pieces, and some still had their torsos intact. Forensic officers counted the remains of 8 victims in total. The police had known that this missing person case might hide more than it showed, but they never expected to find 8 victims in that vault. The investigation of the case began with Elizabeth's husband, Mark Hayden. In November 1998, Elizabeth mysteriously disappeared, but Hayden never reported it to the police, and when her family asked him about it, he gave different stories each time. One time, he said Elizabeth had left home after they had a fight. Another time, he said she had run off with her lover. And once, he said he had just come home and found her already gone. In every version, the main point was always the same. Elizabeth had left on her own. But these changing stories made Elizabeth's brother uncomfortable. He knew his sister would never walk out on her 2 young boys. Something was not right about her disappearance, so he went to the police station and reported it. In the beginning, the police figured this was probably a domestic crime. Hayden's lies had made the whole thing confusing. So they looked into his background and found that he had been in close contact with 2 men for a long time, 32-year-old John Bunting and 27-year-old Robert Wagner. During the investigation, a neighbor told the police that around the time Elizabeth went missing, a Toyota Land Cruiser from the Hayden household had been parked outside Hayden's house. Bunting and Wagner carried several bags and large drums out of the house and loaded them into the vehicle, drove off, and then the vehicle never showed up in Hayden's driveway again. When the police got that information, they started tracking the vehicle and found it in Snowtown, parked outside a house. The tenant on record was listed under the name Mark Lawrence, which was an alias Hayden had used before. In the end, the police opened the vault and found the remains of 8 victims. Just one day after finding the victims, the police raided 3 houses in the northern suburbs of Adelaide. Hayden, Bunting, and Wagner were all arrested. All 3 were charged with just 1 count of murder. Because it was not clear who the victim was, how many people actually died. Then, the police turned their focus to Bunting's old place at 203 Waterloo Corner Road in Salisbury North. Some neighbors had pointed out that the house had been empty for a while, but the man who used to live there had often been digging in the backyard. So the police brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan the area, and the machine showed a spot of about 2 square meters where the soil had been dug up and then filled back in. In the end, they dug up the remains of 2 victims who had been buried for many years. DNA matching was expensive and took a long time. While waiting for the victims' identities to be confirmed, the police went through several old missing persons files. They found that in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, some disappearances had never been properly looked into. A few people had been reported missing but had no formal records, and others had never been reported missing at all. But all of these people had one thing in common. They were connected to Bunting, Wagner, Hayden, and their friend, 19-year-old James Vlasakis. Days later, James was arrested. The police tried to get more information from him because Bunting and Wagner had said nothing since they were arrested. Hayden had also been dodging their questions. In the end, James decided to talk. His confession went on for several weeks, and he gave them every single detail. Bunting had come into James's life when James was in his early teens. At that time, Bunting was living with his mother, Elizabeth Harvey. James said that he had been sexually abused by his stepbrother as a child, and later he had been tormented by a pedophile named Jeffrey Payne. He had told Bunting about all of this back then. When Bunting heard it, he did not act shocked, and he did not offer any comfort. Instead, from that point on, He kept feeding James a hatred of pedophiles and gay men. And then he took James to his house. On the wall in his house was a web made of yarn and little paper slips. Each slip had a person's name on it, and he called it the rock spider wall. The rock spider is Australian slang for a pedophile. Then James talked about Wagner. He said Wagner was tall and very strong, and he had seen Wagner strangle several people to death. As for Hayden, James did not say much about him. He said Hayden rarely showed up at the places where the killings happened, but every time someone was killed, he would turn up in that Toyota Land Cruiser and take care of moving the body. The bank where the victims' remains were found had also been rented by Hayden. Meanwhile, using missing persons reports and James's testimony, the police slowly confirmed who the victims were and how many there had been. The first victim identified was Clinton Trezise. One day in August 1992, Clinton was invited to Bunting's home, where he was beaten to death with a shovel. His body was found in lower light in 1994, but at the time, because his dental records did not match any missing person and no family member came forward to claim him, his body sat unidentified for 5 years. Then there was 26-year-old Ray Davies, a man with an intellectual disability. Bunting had heard that Ray was a pedophile, so in December 1995, he and Wagner tortured and killed him. Next was 47-year-old Suzanne Allen, Bunting's ex-girlfriend. Bunting claimed she had died of a heart attack. Because there was not enough evidence, the prosecution dropped the murder charge in her case. Then, 19-year-old Michelle Gardner. One day, she was playing in the yard with Wagner's children, and during the time, she covered one of the kids' mouths with her hand. That made Wagner angry, so in a shed at Murray Bridge, Bunting and Wagner killed her. 42-year-old Vanessa Lane was Wagner's former partner. Initially, Bunting needed Vanessa to give him information about local pedophiles. But once the information she gave was no longer useful, her past conviction for child sexual offenses became the reason Bunting used to kill her. 18-year-old Thomas Trevelyan was a psychiatric patient who always wore military clothing. He had helped Bunting and Wagner kill Vanessa. But because of his mental illness, Bunting was worried he might talk, so he killed him and made it look like a suicide. Since Thomas had tried to kill himself before, the police ruled it a suicide and closed the case. 29-year-old Gavin Porter, a friend of James and a drug user. Bunting hated drug users, but the thing that finally pushed him to kill Gavin was that one day he got pricked in the hand by a used syringe that Gavin had left on the sofa. So he and Wagner attacked Gavin and strangled him to death. 21-year-old Troy Yude was James's half-brother, the one who had sexually abused him when James was 13. In August 1998, Bunting and Wagner picked up James, went to Troy's place, and tortured him to death there. 18-year-old Frederick Brooks was the son of Elizabeth's sister. According to James's confession, Bunting said Frederick had touched young girls, so they had to kill Frederick. In September 1998, Bunting, Wagner, and James took Frederick back to Bunting's house, where they tortured him to death in the bathroom. They crushed his toes with pliers, stuck cigarettes into his ears and nostrils, shoved a lit sparkler into his urethra, and injected bleach into his testicles. 29-year-old Gary O'Dwyer had suffered brain damage in a car accident and lived alone in a small house. He was also Bunting's neighbor in Murray Bridge. At the time, Bunting had his eye on Gary's disability pension. In October 1998, Bunting told James to go up to Gary and ask him if he had any family. After learning that no one would come looking for him, Bunting and Wagner tortured Gary to death. Then there was Hayden's wife, Elizabeth. At one point, Hayden told Bunting that Elizabeth knew they had killed people. So in November 1998, Bunting and Wagner went after Elizabeth and tortured her to death in the bathroom. The last victim was 24-year-old David Johnson, James's stepbrother. He was the only victim killed in Snowtown. On May 9, 1999, James lured David to the abandoned bank in Snowtown, where Wagner grabbed him by the throat and forced him to hand over his bank card PIN. Then, James and Wagner drove off to withdraw money. When they got back, Bunting had already killed David. According to James's confession, Bunting and Wagner also cut pieces of flesh from David's body with knives and ate them. James had taken part in several murders, but because he cooperated with the prosecution, He got 4 life sentences with a minimum of 26 years. Hayden, he was not convicted of murder, but because he had helped dispose of the corpses after Elizabeth and Troy were killed, he received 25 years in prison. In September 2003, the court found Bunting guilty of 11 counts of murder and gave him 11 life sentences, one after another, with no chance of parole. Wagner admitted to 3 murders and was found guilty of 7 more, which added up to 10 life sentences without parole. At the sentencing, Bunting said nothing, but Wagner spoke up. He said, "Pedophiles were doing terrible things to children. The authorities didn't do anything about it. I decided to take action. I took that action. Thank you." Later, Wagner's words were quoted many times, and in some cases, they would be described as vigilantes. But police investigations and court evidence showed that this was not the case. These victims, only Vanessa really had a criminal record of child sex crimes, and Troy, who sexually abused James himself confirmed this, but most of the remaining victims had no record of sexual offenses. Clinton was openly gay. Ray had an intellectual disability, and the allegation against him came from rumor. Gary had brain damage from a car accident and lived by himself. David was James's stepbrother. These were people who were often poor, sick, unprotected, and overlooked, not the pedophiles Bunting and Wagner made them out to be. As Judge Brian Martin said, these 2 men derive pleasure from killing and are incapable of truly reforming. Later, this series of murders became known as the Snowtown murders, but the name had little to do with the victims. Most of them had never even set foot in Snowtown in their entire lives. Among these 12 victims, some were reported missing, but had no formal missing person reports filed, and others were never reported missing at all. Perhaps, if Elizabeth's brother had not reported her missing to the police, their deaths might have stayed hidden for a long time.